This is lecture 22. We're beginning block 3 now. We'll start with the endocrine system, then we'll get into anabolic androgenic steroids. Then we'll move into enzymes, which is the mode of action for most hormones. And then we'll get into the mechanisms of anabolism, hypertrophy, muscle hypertrophy, and the enzymatic regulation of it. But this lecture, this is just an introduction to hormones. So here's what we're going to go over: the history of the endocrine system, neuroendocrine physiology, and the hypothalamic control over much of your hormone function. So when did it start? When did endocrinology as a field of study begin? Middle of the 19th century, by a guy named Arnold Berthold. He was a German scientist and he was a curator of a zoo at the time. And he did these like creepy studies on roosters, on like chicks or cockerels or whatever the tiny underdeveloped roosters are called. And so he castrated some and then left them as is. He castrated others and then re-implanted the testes. And then with other ones, he castrated them and then attached a different rooster's testes to it. So again, pretty creepy. But on the castrated roosters that were left in that state, he found a small comb and wattle. Um, and they had no interest in the hens, and there was no aggression toward the other males. But for all the other roosters that had, testes reattached, no matter whose they were, um, normal combs and wattles and normal male behavior that you would expect of a rooster. And so he published this in 1849. Again, middle of the 19th century. This is really the foundation of endocrinology as a field of study. Like we've known about this stuff for longer. I mean, in Italy, famous for the castrati or an individual castrato, by the 16th century. And this just means the castration of male singers before puberty, to change their voice so they don't, have puberty affect their voice. Or it actually affects it in that sort of a supposedly a pleasing way. Um, so obviously we've known that the testes contributed to pubescent development and adult features well before Arnold Berthold, but as a field of study, endocrinology as a field of study, middle of the 1800s. And then what Arnold Berthold took from it is that there's some chemical, right? It turns out to be testosterone, but that was later identified, that has systemic effects. And this is a nice summary of his findings. If you're interested in pausing to read it, there's no need. You already know the extent of the history of endocrinology that you need to, but this just summarizes his findings. Now, the neuroendocrine system, remember we have all these different body systems and we group them according to function, right? We label them according to function, not according to like geography. Like here's my leg, here's my head, here's my thorax or whatever. These are the systems that get lumped together based on function, and the nervous system and endocrine system go together, the neuroendocrine system. So what's an endocrine system? It's a bunch of glands and other cells, tissues and cells that secrete messenger molecules, different types of messenger molecules into the blood, generally into the blood, to regulate stuff, to regulate cells, to regulate tissues, to regulate organs, to regulate body systems. So what glands are we talking about? The pituitary, the thyroid, the adrenals, testes and ovaries, the pineal or pineal, depending on where you're from, parathyroid. The pancreas is a organ gland. It's more of a gland than an organ. And then the liver is more of an organ than a gland, but it serves as both too. So what functions are we talking about that these hormones are doing? Sleep wake cycles, the immune system, both activation, inhibition, metabolic regulation. Um, and as a part of metabolic regulation, hypertrophy and atrophy would both fall under that umbrella. Apoptosis and cell survival, control over reproductive functions, thirst and hunger, fight or flight stuff, moods, lots of things. So that's your endocrine system. And why do we refer to it as a neuro endocrine system? How do those two systems interact? We start in the nervous system before we get to the hormones sometimes. The central nervous system, the brain, we often begin there and then go out to the periphery from there. Not always, but a lot of the time, that's how it works. And so one example you should know is epinephrine and cortisol, two examples. And both are shown in the diagram to the left because both are stimulated from the brain and come from the adrenal glands, which are like the little like toupees atop the kidney. And so for epinephrine, the amygdala in the brain sends a distress signal, which gets routed through some sympathetic nerves going through the autonomic nervous system to the adrenal glands. And these glands respond by pumping the hormone epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, that's the same thing, into the bloodstream. So that's the sympatho-adrenomedullary axis. And we'll talk about cortisol soon when we discuss the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. But first, epinephrine is a messenger molecule. And so, what is a messenger molecule? These are just chemicals that relay messages. Hormones typically relay messages over a long range, and the neurotransmitters relay messages over a very short range. And it's like none of these envelopes are addressed to anyone, but that's not how hormones and neurotransmitters work. Um, Hormones and neurotransmitters are addressed to a specific receptor. They don't just bind to any old cell or, tissue or whatever. They bind to a very specific cell surface, usually receptor. Sometimes it could be intracellular receptor. Um, and again, hormones tend to be secreted into the blood where they circulate for a while and eventually find their target cell in their target tissue. So that would be how a classic endocrine hormone works. We'll talk about other types of hormone signaling soon, next lecture. But neurotransmitters, these are released from nerves and then they bind to an adjacent cell, which is often another nerve, but it doesn't have to be. Remember, there's a neuromuscular junction where nerves depolarize muscle, and then fat is also innervated. We'll talk about that innervation soon in a future lecture. Um, in the third edition of the Essentials of Strength Training and Conditioning book, it defines hormones as this: chemical messengers that are synthesized, stored, and released into the blood by endocrine glands and certain other cells. So, by certain other cells, think like leptin and ghrelin. Leptin, the satiety hormone, that's released from fat cells, and that's not really a gland. Fat isn't. It does serve glandular functions, but it's not a gland. And then ghrelin is released from your stomach and some GI tract, and that's also not a gland. So lots of cells release hormones. Um, Glands are just specialized structures for the purpose of releasing them. And that little bit of clarification gets added in the fourth edition of the book of Essential Strength Training and Conditioning. It gives the exact same definition, but it just adds a few extra words. But basically, a chemical messenger molecule um, that's secreted into the blood by stuff, which is, I guess, mostly gland. Pretty much any cell can do this. Now, if you look through the animal kingdom, you're going to find all the same glands. Our physiology isn't it's not unique. I mean, the exact same stuff as in puppies and in cats. So a lot of research on humans is done on animal models. It's usually mice and rats. That's about 95% of the animal population for human studies, but cats on occasion too, and the occasional monkey will make an appearance. So there are a lot of glands and tissues, organs and tissues that behave as glands. Uh, Again, pretty much every cell behaves as a gland to some extent. So the heart you see here, that releases atrial natriuretic peptide. The stomach is shown, that's as we know, that releases ghrelin. The liver isn't shown here, but that releases IGF, insulin-like growth factor, and we'll talk all about that in an upcoming lecture. We can narrow it down to some important hormones that relate to skeletal muscle function, and metabolisms. These are the hormones we're going to be talking about. This is the entire list of hormones we'll be talking about. And each one of these enters the bloodstream, travels around, eventually binds to its target receptor. Remember, the male is all addressed to a very specific, address. And each messenger molecule is going to bind to a very specific receptor. And then when those hormones bind, stuff is regulated. Um, where it says androgens and testicles, the ovaries do produce a small amount of testosterone in women as well, and the adrenal glands do too. Um, but the ovaries are much more responsible for the production of estrogen. Okay, so you remember this diagram, the one on the left, that shows the release of both cortisol and epinephrine from the adrenal glands. Um, Cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. We'll go through some of the hypothalamic pituitary axes now, but if I ask the question, what regulates X, solve for X, whatever it is, what regulates appetite or sleep or hydration or temperature, whatever. Um, the Any of those things, the answer is going to be the hypothalamus. And the pituitary would sort of work too, but the ultimate control, the kind of top-down control comes from the hypothalamus. So the first ever, the reason there's like a Warren Beatty and Trivial Pursuit down there. The first Trivial Pursuit game came out in 1981, the Genus, not the Genius edition, but Genus edition. And Warren Beatty was huge that year. And so in the entertainment questions, if you don't know the answer, just guess Warren Beatty. You'll have a decent chance of getting it right, like for like all of them. Um, in the first block, if the answer, if you didn't know the answer to some question, like, well, because size principle, or because specificity of adaptation, or because self-preservation, something like that probably would have worked. In the second block, like because moment arm length was a reasonable answer. In this, when we're talking about hormones and regulation, and because hypothalamus, that's sort of our new one answer fits most questions response. Now, the hypothalamus, this isn't a gland. That's part of your brain. It's behind the blood-brain barrier. It's protected, and it relays its messages to the pituitary, which is a gland. It's not a piece of brain. And so that's beyond the blood-brain barrier. It's out in the wilds. And there are actually two pituitary glands. The posterior pituitary doesn't produce any hormones, it just stores them. And then the anterior pituitary, that's what makes hormones um, that operate the hypothalamic pituitary axes. So from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, it's connected by blood vessels, not systemic vessels, but vessels that go directly from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. And then the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, this is nerves. And again, the posterior pituitary just stores hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. It's the hypothalamus's storage shed, basically. So the posterior pituitary releases, stores and releases vasopressin and oxytocin. But the anterior pituitary, this is the one we'll focus on because it's responsible for the hypothalamic pituitary fill in the blank axes. And these are critical to survival. If you wind up with an axis problem, a hypothalamic axis problem, and it's not corrected, death will happen because you can't regulate key functions in your body without it. Homeostasis can't be maintained without it. Now, this is a roster of the hypothalamic hormones, not just for the axes, but all of them. You see oxytocin and AVP, that's arginine vasopressin, which used to be called antidiuretic hormone. That name tells you what it does. So by way of analogy, the hypothalamus is the GM, the general manager, the CEO, or the president, whatever. There's too many names for the top person. If this were the office, it would be Jan or David Wallace, some executive whose decisions are mandates. And then the branch manager, the Michael Scott, that's the pituitary. He takes instruction from Jan or David Wallace. And then the branch manager, the pituitary, bosses around the rest of the employees, other glands and tissues and whatever, Dwight and Jim and Andy and Oscar and Angela and everyone. So there are four axes to know. The pituitary isn't all of these. It's the anterior pituitary that we're talking about. It's always the anterior pituitary for these axes. So there's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's how you get cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Um, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, that's how you get your T3 and T4, your thyroid hormones, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, that's how you get androgens and estrogens. And then there's the hypothalamic pituitary liver axis. The hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, or it can release somatostatin, which would be inhibitory to this. But if you're going to turn on this axis, the hypothalamus releases growth hormone releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary, again, always is the anterior, to release growth hormone. And then that causes the liver to release IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. So here's another look at the axes. The posterior pituitary is releasing, vasopressin and oxytocin. Those are not axes. The anterior pituitary is releasing the hormones that function as general managers, right? As the Michael Scott's, if that office reference makes sense to you. The anterior pituitaries of the axes are being relayed through. So the neuroendocrine system, the hypothalamus is the major neuro part overseeing endocrine function. Not all endocrine function, but a lot of it. So again, what regulates X? This big list of functions, the hypothalamus is regulating all of that stuff. And this is the stuff it's releasing. You should have some idea what these things are doing. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's on its way to the gonads, right? First to the pituitary to release luteinizing, follicle stimulating hormone. Um, Vasopressin that's produced in your hypothalamus, stored and released from the posterior pituitary. And remember, that's your antidiuretic hormone. And you don't need to know prolactin releasing hormone or oxytocin. And then you get to the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, and here are the hormones it's releasing to complete the axes. Um, and so you know these four axes, these are the same ones we just talked about. And these are the questions, these are our review questions for this lecture. Get to know these, and I will see you in the next lecture where we'll get a little bit deeper into hormone actions.